In the gentle mists of time, before the great palaces of Versailles knew the thunder of revolution, there lived a kingdom wrapped in silken dreams and gilded shadows. The France of old seemed eternal, as if carved from marble and blessed by heaven itself, where kings ruled by divine right and the ancient rhythms of feudal life pulsed through cobblestone streets and countryside meadows. Yet beneath this serene surface, currents of change moved like underground rivers, patient and persistent, carrying the seeds of transformation that would reshape not only France, but the very conception of human society itself. The story begins not with violence, but with the quiet accumulation of centuries, like snow gathering on mountain peaks before the avalanche. In the France of the 1700s, the social order seemed as fixed as the stars themselves. At the apex stood the monarchy, surrounded by the glittering nobility who traced their bloodlines to medieval knights and whose very existence was justified by tradition stretching back to Charlemagne. Below them, the clergy formed the first estate, guardians of souls and keepers of vast wealth, their monasteries and cathedrals rising like prayers made stone across the landscape. The second estate, the nobility, lived in their chateaux and townhouses, their lives a perpetual dance of court ritual and provincial authority. But it was the third estate that formed the great foundation of this pyramid, encompassing everyone else, from wealthy merchants in Lyon and Bordeaux to the countless peasants who worked the soil with their hands, their backs bent under the weight of feudal obligations that stretched back generations. This was the France of quiet villages, where church bells marked the hours, where harvest festivals celebrated the turning of seasons, and where most people lived and died within a few miles of their birthplace, their lives governed by customs older than memory. As you drift deeper into this tale, imagine the France of Louis XIV, the Sun King, whose reign had established the absolute monarchy that would define the Ancien Régime. His palace at Versailles became a glittering trap for the nobility, drawing them from their provincial estates to dance attendance on royal whims. The elaborate etiquette of court life turned formerly independent nobles into courtiers, dependent on royal favour for their fortunes. The Sun King's famous declaration, "L'État, c'est moi," I am the state, captured the essence of absolute monarchy, where the king's will was law and his person sacred. Yet even in those golden days, the seeds of fiscal crisis were being sown. The construction of Versailles itself, with its hall of mirrors reflecting infinite luxury, its fountains dancing to the music of court composers, and its gardens stretching to the horizon, consumed enormous resources. Wars of dynastic ambition, the War of Spanish Succession, conflicts in the Americas, the struggle for European dominance, drained the royal treasury even as they enhanced French prestige. The monarchy lived in splendor while mortgaging its future, a pattern that would echo through the decades. The reign of Louis XV, the well-beloved, saw the continuation of these patterns amid the flowering of Enlightenment thought. In the salons of Paris, philosophers and writers began to question the very foundations of the old order. Voltaire, with his razor wit and passionate advocacy for religious tolerance, challenged the authority of the church. Rousseau, the citizen of Geneva, proclaimed that man was born free, but everywhere was in chains, and that the general will of the people should govern society. Diderot and d'Alembert compiled their great Encyclopédie, a monument to human reason that sought to catalogue all knowledge and, in doing so, to illuminate the darkness of superstition and tradition. These ideas spread like morning light through the drawing rooms and coffee houses of France, carried by the very nobles who would later find themselves swept away by the forces they had inadvertently helped to unleash. The Enlightenment created a new vocabulary for understanding government, society, and human rights, concepts that would prove revolutionary in their implications. Natural rights, the social contract, the separation of powers, religious tolerance. These were not merely abstract philosophical concepts, but practical challenges to the established order. The economic foundations of the old regime were equally fragile, built on a system of taxation that exempted those most able to pay, while burdening those least able to bear the weight. The nobility and clergy, who controlled most of the land and wealth, enjoyed exemption from most taxes as a matter of privilege. The burden fell instead on the third estate, from prosperous bourgeois merchants to struggling peasants, creating a system that was both inequitable and inefficient. As the night continues to deepen around you, consider how this fundamental injustice created resentment that accumulated like pressure in a sealed vessel. The 7 Years' War, fought across continents from 1756 to 1763, marked a turning point in France's financial fortunes. Though the conflict brought glory to some and established France as a global power, it also bankrupted the royal treasury. The cost of maintaining armies in Europe, India, and North America, combined with the expense of the French court, created a fiscal crisis that would haunt every subsequent monarch. The loss of New France to Britain was both a blow to French prestige and a costly lesson in the price of global ambition. When Louis XV died in 1774, worn down by years of rule and the weight of accumulating problems, he left behind a kingdom facing unprecedented challenges. His successor, Louis XVI, was a well-meaning but indecisive young man who inherited not only the crown but also the crushing burden of the monarchy's debts. Unlike his predecessors, Louis XVI was genuinely interested in reform and sympathetic to the suffering of his people, but he lacked the political skill and determination necessary to navigate the treacherous waters of 18th century French politics. The new king's queen, Marie Antoinette, daughter of the Austrian Empress Maria Theresa, became a symbol of royal excess in the popular imagination, though the reality was more complex. Her Austrian origins made her suspect to many French nobles, who viewed her as a foreign influence on their king. Her love of fashion, gambling, and expensive entertainments provided ready ammunition for critics of the monarchy, even though her personal expenditures were only a tiny fraction of the royal budget. As time passed, she became the focus of increasingly vicious pamphlets and rumors, transformed in the popular mind from a young woman enjoying the privileges of her position into a symbol of aristocratic indifference to popular suffering. The financial crisis deepened with France's involvement in the American Revolution. The decision to support the American colonists against Britain was motivated by the desire for revenge against their traditional enemy and the hope of weakening British power. French military advisors, supplies, and eventually troops played a crucial role in American victory, but the cost was enormous. The irony was not lost on contemporaries. France had bankrupted itself to help establish a republic based on the very principles of popular sovereignty and individual rights that challenged the foundations of absolute monarchy. As you settle more deeply into rest, let your mind wander through the France of the 1780s, where the contradictions of the old regime were becoming increasingly apparent. The monarchy faced a fiscal crisis that threatened the very existence of the state, yet the privileged orders refused to surrender their tax exemptions. The ideas of the Enlightenment had created a new understanding of legitimate government based on reason and consent, yet the actual government continued to rely on tradition and divine right. The bourgeoisie had grown wealthy and sophisticated, yet they remained excluded from political power by the accidents of birth. The Assembly of Notables, convened in 1787, represented Louis XVI's attempt to address the fiscal crisis through negotiation rather than royal decree. The king's finance minister, Charles Alexandre de Calonne, proposed a revolutionary new tax system that would include the nobility and clergy. But the privileged orders refused to accept any significant reduction in their ancient prerogatives. The Assembly's failure demonstrated the impossibility of reform from within the existing system. The very people who needed to surrender their privileges were the ones with the power to block change. The appointment of Jacques Necker as Director General of Finances brought temporary hope. Necker, a Swiss Protestant banker, was popular with the public for his efforts at financial reform and his publication of the Compte Rendu, which gave the people their first detailed look at royal finances. However, his Protestant faith and foreign birth made him suspect to the court, and his reform efforts were constantly undermined by noble opposition. His dismissal in 1781 and subsequent recall in 1788 reflected the monarchy's desperate search for solutions to an increasingly intractable problem. By 1788, the monarchy faced not only financial collapse, but also a broader crisis of legitimacy. The Parlement of Paris, traditionally a supporter of royal authority, had joined the opposition to new taxes and was demanding the convocation of the Estates General, which had not met since 1614. Popular unrest was growing, fueled by economic hardship, social inequality, and the spread of revolutionary ideas. The harvest failures of 1788 created widespread food shortages, and the winter of 1788 to 1789 was particularly harsh, adding physical suffering to political discontent. The decision to convene the Estates General for May 1789 represented the monarchy's acknowledgement that it could no longer govern without the consent of its subjects. Yet this concession to popular pressure also opened the door to revolutionary change. The very act of calling the Estates General implied that the king was not absolute, that he needed the approval of his subjects for his policies. This was a fundamental break with the theory of divine right monarchy, and it would prove impossible to limit the implications of this break. The preparations for the Estates General revealed the depth of popular discontent and the sophistication of political thought that had developed during the preceding decades. The cahiers de doléances, lists of grievances compiled by each estate, provided a comprehensive catalogue of the problems facing France and the reforms desired by the people. These documents, numbering in the tens of thousands, revealed a society ready for fundamental change, united in their desire for justice and representation, but divided in their vision of what that change should look like. As the spring of 1789 approached, France seemed balanced on the edge of transformation. The flowering trees of the Île-de-France, the gentle hills of Normandy, the vineyards of Burgundy, all appeared unchanged. Yet the kingdom itself was about to undergo a metamorphosis as profound as any in human history. The old world of fixed hierarchies and unquestioned authority was about to give way to something entirely new, something that would challenge every assumption about government, society, and human nature. The representatives of the three estates began arriving in Versailles in late April and early May 1789, carrying with them the hopes and fears of their constituents. The clergy came in their black robes, representing both the parish priests who lived among the people and the wealthy bishops who moved in the highest circles of society. The nobility arrived in their silk and velvet, sword at their side, representing centuries of military service and feudal privilege. The Third Estate came in their simple black coats, representing everyone else: the lawyers and merchants, the artisans and farmers, the rising bourgeoisie, and the struggling masses. The opening ceremony on May 5th, 1789, in the church of Saint-Louis at Versailles, was a magnificent display of royal pageantry. The king and queen processed through the streets of Versailles, surrounded by the representatives of the three estates, while crowds cheered and church bells rang. Yet beneath the ceremony lay profound tensions about the nature of representation and the distribution of power. The Third Estate, which represented the vast majority of the population, was outnumbered by the combination of the First and Second Estates, ensuring that the privileged orders could block any reforms that threatened their interests. The immediate crisis arose over the fundamental question of how the Estates General would conduct its business. The Third Estate demanded voting by head, which would give them a decisive voice given their numbers, and the likelihood that some clergy and liberal nobles would support reform. The privileged orders insisted on voting by estate, which would preserve their traditional dominance. This seemingly technical dispute actually concerned the fundamental nature of French society, whether it would continue to be organized around privilege and tradition, or whether it would embrace the principle of equality. The Third Estate's declaration of June 17, 1789, that they constituted the National Assembly of France, marked the true beginning of the revolution. This was not merely a procedural maneuver, but a revolutionary claim to represent the sovereign will of the French people. By declaring themselves the National Assembly, the Third Estate was asserting that legitimate government derived from the people, not from ancient custom or divine appointment. This was the same principle that had animated the American Revolution, but it was now being applied to the oldest and most powerful monarchy in Europe. The tennis court oath, taken on June 20, 1789, when the Third Estate found themselves locked out of their usual meeting place, became one of the founding moments of modern democracy. In the indoor tennis court of Versailles, 576 members of the Third Estate swore not to separate until they had given France a new constitution. This oath, administered by the astronomer Jean-Sylvain Bailly, who would later become the first mayor of Paris, committed the representatives to the revolutionary principle that government must be based on the consent of the governed. As you drift deeper into sleep, let your mind rest on the image of those men in that tennis court, their hands raised in solemn oath, their faces lit by the conviction that they were participating in a moment that would change history. They were mostly lawyers and merchants, men of the comfortable middle class who had never expected to find themselves making revolution. Yet they were united by their commitment to principles that transcended their individual interests: justice, equality, and the rule of law. The king's response to the National Assembly's declaration revealed the fundamental weakness of the old regime. Louis XVI wavered between conciliation and resistance, sometimes supporting reform and sometimes opposing it, creating confusion and uncertainty that weakened royal authority. His famous Séance Royale of June 23, 1789, in which he attempted to reassert royal control over the reform process, came too late and offered too little. The representatives of the Third Estate, led by Honoré Gabriel Riquetti, Count of Mirabeau, refused to disperse, with Mirabeau famously declaring that they would not move except at the point of bayonets. The revolution that had begun in the meeting halls of Versailles soon spread to the streets of Paris. The dismissal of Jacques Necker on July 11, 1789, sparked popular uprising in the capital. Necker had become a symbol of reform and fiscal responsibility. and his dismissal was seen as evidence that the king was abandoning his commitment to change. The people of Paris responded with a combination of political organisation and violent uprising that would characterise the revolution throughout its course. The storming of the Bastille on July 14, 1789, became the symbolic moment when the people of Paris joined the political revolution that had begun at Versailles. The Bastille, a medieval fortress that had served as a royal prison, represented royal authority and the arbitrary exercise of power. Though it contained only 7 prisoners at the time of its capture, its fall was seen as the triumph of popular will over royal tyranny. The crowd that gathered before its walls included artisans, shopkeepers, and labourers, united in their determination to defend the revolution against counter-revolutionary forces. The capture of the Bastille was not merely symbolic, but practical. The crowd was seeking gunpowder to arm the newly formed National Guard, the citizen militia that had emerged to maintain order in Paris. The governor of the Bastille, Bernard-René de Launay, found himself caught between his duty to defend the fortress and his reluctance to fire on French citizens. After hours of negotiation and rising tension, the crowd breached the fortress, and Delaunay was killed in the violence that followed. His head was paraded through the streets of Paris on a pike, a grisly precedent for the revolutionary violence that would follow. The news of the Bastille's fall spread rapidly throughout France, carried by messengers and letters that described the people's victory over royal authority. In towns and villages across the kingdom, the people responded with their own uprisings, seizing control of local government and establishing revolutionary committees. The Great Fear, as historians would later call it, swept through the countryside as peasants attacked noble chateaux and destroyed the documents that recorded their feudal obligations. This rural revolution was both a response to the political revolution in Paris and a separate uprising against the feudal system that had oppressed the peasantry for centuries. The night of August 4th, 1789, became known as the night that feudalism died in France. In an extraordinary session of the National Assembly, noble after noble rose to renounce their feudal privileges, caught up in the enthusiasm of the moment and the pressure of revolutionary events. The Assembly abolished serfdom, feudal courts, hunting privileges, and the countless obligations that had bound the peasantry to their lords. The Marquis de Lafayette, hero of the American Revolution, declared that the Assembly was witnessing the birth of a new France based on equality and justice. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, adopted on August 26, 1789, established the philosophical foundation of the new France. This document, influenced by the American Declaration of Independence and the Virginia Declaration of Rights, proclaimed that all men are born free and equal in rights, that the source of all sovereignty lies in the nation, and that the purpose of government is to protect the natural rights of man. These principles challenged not only the old regime in France, but the entire system of absolute monarchy that dominated Europe. As the autumn of 1789 deepened, the revolution faced its first major crisis. The king's reluctance to approve the Assembly's decrees, combined with continued economic hardship and food shortages, created a volatile situation in Paris. The October days, when thousands of Parisian women marched to Versailles demanding bread and the king's approval of the Assembly's work, marked another turning point in the revolution. The crowd that gathered at Versailles was led by women from the markets of Paris, their daily struggle to feed their families having politicized them in ways that the formal politics of the Assembly could not. The march to Versailles on October 5th, 1789, began at the Hôtel de Ville in Paris, where Stanislas Marie Maillard, a veteran of the Bastille, helped organize the crowd. The women were joined by National Guardsmen under Lafayette's command, creating a formidable force that could not be ignored. At Versailles, they invaded the assembly and demanded that the king come to Paris, closer to his people and away from the corrupting influence of the court. The king's eventual agreement to move to Paris marked the end of Versailles as the center of French political life and the beginning of the king's effective captivity. The royal family's forced move to the Tuileries Palace in Paris in October 1789 symbolized the transfer of power from the monarchy to the people. The Tuileries, though still a royal palace, was surrounded by the revolutionary crowds of Paris and subject to their constant surveillance. The king and queen found themselves living in a goldfish bowl, their every move watched and reported by the revolutionary press. Marie Antoinette, in particular, became the target of increasingly vicious attacks that portrayed her as a foreign enemy of the revolution and a symbol of aristocratic excess. The work of creating a new France continued through the winter of 1789 to 1790, as the National Assembly laboured to transform the philosophical principles of the Declaration of Rights into practical legislation. The Assembly restructured the administration of France, dividing the country into departments based on geographic and economic logic rather than historical accident. They reformed the judicial system, creating elected judges and trial by jury. They established civil marriage and divorce, secularizing one of the most intimate aspects of human life. The civil constitution of the clergy, adopted in July 1790, represented one of the most controversial and ultimately divisive aspects of the early revolution. The Assembly, facing a fiscal crisis inherited from the old regime, decided to nationalize the property of the Catholic Church and reorganize the clergy as civil servants. This decision was driven by both financial necessity and ideological conviction. The revolutionaries saw the church as a pillar of the old regime and believed that its power needed to be curtailed. However, the requirement that clergy swear an oath of loyalty to the new constitution created a schism within the church that would have lasting consequences. The Festival of Federation on July 14th, 1790, the first anniversary of the fall of the Bastille, represented the high point of revolutionary unity and optimism. The Champ de Mars in Paris was transformed into an amphitheatre where representatives from across France gathered to celebrate the new constitutional order. The king himself participated in the ceremony, swearing to uphold the constitution and receiving the enthusiastic cheers of the crowd. Lafayette, as commander of the National Guard, administered the oath to the assembled federates, and the ceremony concluded with a Te Deum, sung by a choir of 1,200 voices. Yet even at this moment of apparent triumph, the seeds of future conflict were already visible. The non-juring clergy, those priests who refused to swear the constitutional oath, were beginning to organize resistance to the revolutionary settlement. The emigration of nobles who refused to accept the new order was creating a counter-revolutionary force beyond France's borders. The sans-culottes, the urban workers who had provided much of the revolutionary energy, were beginning to demand more radical changes than the bourgeois leadership of the Assembly was prepared to accept. As you settle deeper into the rhythm of this tale, let your mind drift to the France of 1791, where the revolution seemed to have achieved a stable settlement. The new constitution, completed in September 1791, established a constitutional monarchy with a separation of powers that the philosophers had advocated. The king retained executive power, but was bound by the constitution and subject to the law. The legislative assembly, elected by property owners, represented the nation and controlled taxation and legislation. The judiciary was independent and based on the principle of equality before the law. The flight to Varennes in June 1791 shattered the illusion of royal acceptance of the revolutionary settlement. The king and queen's attempt to flee France and join the counter-revolutionary forces gathering on the frontiers revealed their true feelings about the revolution. Though they were brought back to Paris, and the Assembly maintained the fiction that they had been kidnapped by enemies of the state, the incident fatally undermined the monarchy's credibility. The revelation that the king had been secretly corresponding with foreign powers and plotting against the revolution transformed him from a reluctant constitutional monarch into a potential traitor. The massacre of the Champ de Mars on July 17, 1791, marked the first time that the revolutionary government turned its weapons against the people in the name of order and stability. A crowd had gathered at the Champ de Mars to sign a petition demanding the king's abdication, but the National Guard, under Lafayette's command, fired on the crowd, killing approximately 50 people. This incident revealed the growing tensions within the revolutionary coalition between those who wanted to halt the revolution at constitutional monarchy and those who demanded more radical change. The Legislative Assembly that convened in October 1791 faced challenges that would ultimately prove beyond its capacity to resolve. The new constitution's attempt to create a stable settlement satisfied neither the counter-revolutionaries who wanted to restore the old regime nor the radicals who wanted to push the revolution forward. The assembly was dominated by the Girondins, a loose coalition of deputies who favoured war against the European powers that were harbouring French émigrés and threatening intervention. Their leader, Jacques-Pierre Brissot, argued that war would unite the French people and expose the enemies of the revolution both at home and abroad. The declaration of war against Austria on April 20, 1792, marked the beginning of more than 2 decades of almost continuous warfare that would reshape Europe. The decision for war was supported by both the Girondins, who saw it as necessary to defend the revolution, and by the king and queen, who hoped that military defeat would discredit the revolution and restore the old regime. Only a few voices, most notably Maximilien Robespierre, warned that war would radicalize the revolution and lead to military dictatorship. The early military campaigns of 1792 were disastrous for France. The army, weakened by the emigration of noble officers and the disruption of the old military hierarchy, suffered a series of defeats. The declaration of Pillnitz by Austria and Prussia, though actually quite cautious in its language, was interpreted in France as a threat to invade and restore the old regime. The Duke of Brunswick's manifesto, threatening to destroy Paris if the royal family was harmed, further inflamed French public opinion and convinced many that the revolution was fighting for its very survival. The insurrection of August 10, 1792, brought the constitutional monarchy to an end and opened the radical phase of the revolution. The event began with the storming of the Tuileries Palace by a crowd of Parisian militants supported by federates from the provinces, particularly the Marseillaise, whose revolutionary song would become the national anthem. The Swiss guards defending the palace were massacred, and the royal family was forced to take refuge in the Legislative Assembly. The Assembly, faced with the accomplished fact of the monarchy's overthrow, suspended the king and called for the election of a national convention to draft a new constitution. The September massacres of 1792 revealed the violent potential that lay beneath the surface of the revolution. As news arrived of Prussian advances toward Paris, panic gripped the capital. Rumors spread that counter-revolutionary prisoners were planning to break out and massacre patriotic citizens. Over several days in early September, crowds stormed the prisons of Paris, and killed more than 1,000 prisoners, including priests, nobles, and common criminals. The massacres were organized by popular tribunals that conducted summary trials, but the violence was both spontaneous and systematic, revealing how the revolution had legitimized popular justice while undermining legal restraints. The National Convention that convened in September 1792 faced the dual challenge of creating a new government and defending the revolution against foreign invasion. The Convention's first act was to abolish the monarchy and proclaim the Republic, making France the first great power to adopt republican government since ancient Rome. The deputies were divided into three main factions: the Girondins, who wanted a decentralized republic dominated by the educated middle class; the Montagnards or Jacobins, who favored a centralized republic responsive to popular will; and the Plain, a large group of uncommitted deputies who would support whichever faction seemed most capable of preserving the revolution. The trial of Louis XVI in the winter of 1792 to 1793 forced the Convention to confront the question of what to do with the former king. The discovery of the Armoire de Fer, a secret cabinet containing the king's correspondence with foreign enemies, provided evidence of his treason. The trial became a debate about the nature of the revolution itself. The Girondins argued for clemency, proposing that the king be exiled or imprisoned. The Montagnards, led by Robespierre and Louis-Antoine de Saint-Just, argued that the king must die to prove that the revolution had broken completely with the past. The execution of Louis XVI on January 21st, 1793, in the Place de la Révolution, now Place de la Concorde, marked a point of no return for the revolution. The king's death on the guillotine, witnessed by thousands of Parisians, demonstrated that the revolution had indeed broken with the principle of sacred monarchy. As the executioner held up the severed head of the former king, the crowd shouted, "Vive la République!" But the moment was also filled with an ominous silence that suggested the weight of what had been done. The execution of the king made reconciliation with the old regime impossible and ensured that the revolution would be a fight to the finish. The war that had begun as a limited conflict with Austria expanded rapidly after the king's execution. Britain, Spain, and the Dutch Republic joined the first coalition against France, while internal rebellions in the Vendée and other regions threatened the Republic from within. The Convention faced the challenge of fighting a war on multiple fronts, while simultaneously creating new institutions and dealing with economic crisis. The revolutionary government's response was to centralize power and mobilize the entire nation for war, creating what would later be called the First Modern Total War. The revolt in the Vendée, which began in March 1793, represented the most serious internal threat to the revolution. The peasants of Western France, motivated by attachment to their non-juring priests and resentment of revolutionary policies, rose in rebellion against the Republic. Led by nobles like François Athanase Charette de la Contrie and Henri de la Roche-Jacquelin, the rebels formed the Catholic and Royal Army and achieved remarkable initial success. The Vendée War, as it came to be known, would continue for years and cost hundreds of thousands of lives, revealing the depth of the divisions within French society. The expulsion of the Girondins from the Convention on June 2nd, 1793, marked the triumph of the Montagnards and the beginning of the Reign of Terror. The Girondin deputies, accused of federalism and moderation, were arrested by the Paris Commune with the support of the sans-culottes. This purge of the Convention eliminated the last significant opposition to radical policies and concentrated power in the hands of the Committee of Public Safety, which became the effective government of France. The committee, led by figures like Robespierre, Georges Danton, and Lazare Carnot, wielded dictatorial power in the name of saving the revolution. The Constitution of 1793, adopted by the Convention but never implemented, represented the most democratic document produced by the revolution. It guaranteed universal male suffrage, the right to work, the right to education, and the right to rebellion against oppression. However, the Convention voted to suspend the Constitution until the peace, acknowledging that the extreme circumstances of war and internal rebellion made democratic government impossible. This decision to postpone democracy in order to save it would have profound implications for the future of the revolution. As the night deepens around you, let your mind rest on the France of 1793 to 1794, when the revolution reached its most radical phase. The Committee of Public Safety, working from its headquarters in the former Hôtel de Brion, directed not only the war effort, but also the transformation of French society. The committee's members worked with superhuman energy, often sleeping in their offices and laboring 18 hours a day to coordinate the defense of the Republic. They saw themselves as the instruments of the general will, sacrificing their personal comfort and safety for the good of the nation. The law of suspects, passed in September 1793, gave the revolutionary government sweeping powers to arrest anyone deemed dangerous to the Republic. The law's deliberately vague language meant that almost anyone could be arrested on suspicion of counter-revolutionary activity. This legal framework, combined with the Revolutionary Tribunal's summary procedures, created the machinery of the terror, the guillotine invented by Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotin, as a humane method of execution, became the symbol of revolutionary justice, its blade falling daily in the Place de la Révolution. The de-Christianization campaign of 1793 to 1794 represented the revolution's most radical attack on traditional religion. Inspired by the cult of reason promoted by Jacques Hébert and other radical leaders, revolutionary armies toured the countryside, closing churches, destroying religious images, and forcing priests to marry. The Cathedral of Notre Dame was transformed into a temple of reason, with an actress representing the goddess of reason enthroned on the high altar. This campaign alienated many French people who had supported the revolution but remained attached to their traditional faith. The economic policies of the Terror reflected the sans-culottes' demand for social equality and the government's need to mobilize resources for war. The Maximum, a system of price controls on grain and other necessities, was intended to ensure that the poor could afford basic necessities. The levée en masse, decreed in August 1793, mobilized the entire population for war effort, creating an army of nearly 1 million men. These policies, though sometimes economically disruptive, demonstrated the revolution's commitment to popular welfare and national defense. The Festival of the Supreme Being, organized by Robespierre on June 8, 1794, represented his attempt to create a new civic religion that would unite the French people around revolutionary principles. The festival, held on an artificial mountain constructed in the Champ de Mars, was designed to demonstrate that the revolution was compatible with belief in God and moral values. Robespierre himself presided over the ceremony, setting fire to a statue representing atheism and revealing beneath it a statue of wisdom. However, the festival's obvious artificiality and Robespierre's prominent role made many deputies uncomfortable with what seemed like a new form of dictatorship. The victory at Fleurus on June 26, 1794, marked the turning point in the Revolutionary Wars. The French army, reorganized and inspired by revolutionary fervor, defeated the Austrian and Dutch forces and opened the way for the conquest of Belgium. This victory, combined with other successes on the Rhine and Pyrenees, ended the immediate threat to the revolution and raised questions about the continued necessity of the terror. If the Republic was no longer in danger, why did the emergency measures continue? The Great Terror of the summer of 1794 saw the acceleration of executions as Robespierre and his allies sought to purify the revolution of its enemies. The law of 22nd Prairial, passed in June 1794, streamlined the procedures of the Revolutionary Tribunal, eliminating many legal protections for the accused. More than 1,300 people were executed in Paris during the 6 weeks between the passage of this law and Robespierre's fall, earning this period the name of the Great Terror. The executions included not only nobles and clergy, but also former revolutionaries who had fallen from favor, creating fear even among the Convention's deputies. The fall of Robespierre on 9 Thermidor, July 27, 1794, ended the terror and opened a new phase of the revolution. The complex plot that brought down the Incorruptible, as Robespierre was known, involved various factions united only in their fear of becoming his next victims. The decisive moment came when Robespierre's speech to the Convention on 8 Thermidor, in which he hinted at further purges without naming names, convinced the uncommitted deputies that they might be next. The following day, when Robespierre tried to speak in the Convention, he was shouted down with cries of, "Down with the tyrant!" The arrest and execution of Robespierre and his allies on 10 Thermidor marked the end of the most radical phase of the revolution. The man who had dominated the Committee of Public Safety for more than a year, who had been called the Incorruptible for his moral purity and dedication to revolutionary principles, died on the same scaffold where he had sent so many others. His death was greeted with celebration in Paris, but it also marked the beginning of a conservative reaction that would ultimately lead to the abandonment of many revolutionary ideals. The Thermidorian reaction, as historians would later call the period following Robespierre's fall, saw the gradual dismantling of the terror's machinery and the return to more moderate policies. The surviving Girondins were recalled to the Convention, the price controls of the maximum were abandoned, and the churches were reopened. However, the reaction also brought with it a revival of royalist sentiment and counter-revolutionary activity. The White Terror in the south of France saw the massacre of former terrorists and Jacobins, demonstrating that the cycle of violence had not ended with Robespierre's death. The Constitution of 1795, which established the Directory, represented an attempt to create a stable republican government that would avoid both the chaos of democracy and the terror of dictatorship. The new constitution established a bicameral legislature and a 5-man executive with suffrage limited to property owners. The system was designed to prevent any single person or faction from gaining too much power, but it also created a weak government that struggled to deal with the problems facing France. The Directory would be remembered as a period of corruption, inefficiency, and political instability. As you drift deeper into restful sleep, let your mind wander through the France of the Directory, where the revolutionary fervor of the early years had given way to a weary pragmatism. The country was exhausted by years of upheaval, and many citizens simply wanted stability and the chance to rebuild their lives. The grand ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity remained inscribed on public buildings, but they seemed increasingly distant from the daily reality of political maneuvering and economic hardship. The Directory faced immediate challenges that tested its capacity to govern. The assignats, the paper currency issued by the revolution to finance the war effort, had become virtually worthless through inflation. The economy was in shambles, with trade disrupted and productive capacity damaged by years of war and internal conflict. The government's attempts to stabilize the currency through new issues of paper money only made the situation worse, creating a vicious cycle of inflation that impoverished creditors and created windfall profits for debtors. The conspiracy of Gracchus Babeuf in 1796 represented the last gasp of radical revolutionary democracy. Babeuf, who called himself Gracchus after the Roman tribune, advocated complete economic equality and the abolition of private property. His conspiracy of equals planned to overthrow the Directory and establish a communist society based on common ownership of all goods. Though the conspiracy was easily suppressed and Babeuf executed, it demonstrated that the revolutionary tradition of popular democracy had not been completely extinguished by the Thermidorian reaction. The revival of Catholicism under the Directory reflected the exhaustion of revolutionary de-Christianization and the deep religious needs of the French people. Though the state remained officially secular, the government allowed the reopening of churches and the return of non-juring priests who were willing to accept the new political order. This religious revival was particularly strong in the countryside, where traditional faith had never been completely suppressed. The ringing of church bells, silent for years, once again marked the rhythm of village life across France. The emergence of salon society in post-Thermidorian Paris reflected the desire of the French elite to return to the refined pleasures of civilized life. Madame Tallien, Joséphine de Beauharnais, and other society leaders created new centers of cultural and political influence, where art, literature, and politics mingled in an atmosphere of studied elegance. These salons, reminiscent of those of the old Régime, but with a distinctly modern character, became meeting places for the new ruling class of the Directory period. The Directory's foreign policy was dominated by the continuation of the revolutionary wars, which had now become wars of conquest rather than defense. The French armies, battle-tested and inspired by revolutionary ideals, proved remarkably successful against the traditional armies of the European monarchies. The conquest of Belgium and the Rhineland brought considerable wealth to France, while the creation of sister republics in the Netherlands, Switzerland, and Italy spread revolutionary principles across Europe. It was in Italy that a young Corsican general named Napoleon Bonaparte first demonstrated the military genius that would make him master of Europe. Born in Ajaccio, just a year after Corsica became French, Napoleon embodied the revolutionary principle of careers open to talent. His rapid rise from artillery lieutenant to general reflected the opportunities created by the revolution for men of ability, regardless of birth. His victories against the Austrians and Piedmontese in 1796 to 1797 made him a hero in France and demonstrated the possibility of revolutionary expansion beyond France's natural frontiers. The Treaty of Campo Formio, negotiated by Napoleon with Austria in 1797, marked the emergence of France as the dominant power in Western Europe. The treaty gave France control of Belgium and the Rhineland while establishing French influence in northern Italy through the creation of the Cisalpine Republic. More importantly, it demonstrated Napoleon's skill as a diplomat as well as a general, his ability to translate military success into political advantage. The young general was already showing signs of the ambition that would eventually make him emperor. The coup of 18 Fructidor, September 4th, 1797, revealed the Directory's fundamental weakness and its dependence on military support to maintain power. when royalist candidates won significant victories in the elections of 1797, threatening to restore the monarchy through legal means, the Directory called on the army to purge the legislature and annul the election results. This military intervention in politics established a dangerous precedent and demonstrated that the Directory could not govern through constitutional means alone. The Egyptian expedition of 1798 to 1799 represented Napoleon's attempt to strike at British power while advancing his own career. Unable to invade Britain directly, Napoleon proposed to attack British interests in the east by conquering Egypt and threatening British India. The expedition was a fascinating mixture of military campaign and scientific exploration, with Napoleon bringing not only soldiers but also scholars to study the ancient civilization of the Nile. The discovery of the Rosetta Stone during this expedition would eventually unlock the secrets of hieroglyphic writing, but the immediate military results were less successful. The Battle of the Nile, where Admiral Horatio Nelson destroyed the French fleet, stranded Napoleon's army in Egypt and demonstrated British naval supremacy. Though Napoleon achieved spectacular victories on land, notably at the Battle of the Pyramids, the loss of naval support made the Egyptian expedition ultimately pointless. More importantly, the expedition removed Napoleon from Europe at a crucial moment when the Directory was facing new military challenges from the Second Coalition of European powers. The War of the Second Coalition, which began in 1798, saw France facing a renewed alliance of Austria, Russia, and Britain. The French armies, weakened by years of continuous campaigning and deprived of their best general in Egypt, suffered a series of defeats. The loss of Italy, where Napoleon had won such brilliant victories, was particularly damaging to French prestige. The Directory's inability to deal with these military reverses further undermined its already weak position. As the night continues its peaceful embrace, consider the France of 1799, where political crisis and military defeat created the conditions for another change of regime. The Directory's attempts to maintain power through electoral manipulation and military intervention had destroyed its legitimacy, while its inability to achieve decisive victory in war or stability at home convinced many that new leadership was necessary. The stage was set for the emergence of a strong man who could restore order and victory. Napoleon's return from Egypt in October 1799 provided the opportunity that ambitious politicians had been seeking. His military reputation remained intact despite the ultimate failure of the Egyptian expedition, and his name was associated with the great victories of the early revolutionary wars. More importantly, he was untainted by the corruption and inefficiency that had marked the Directory period. His very presence in Paris created possibilities that had not existed before. The coup of 18 Brumaire, November 9, 1799, brought Napoleon to power and effectively ended the French Revolution as a democratic movement. The coup was carefully planned by Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès and other directors who hoped to use Napoleon as their instrument, but the young general quickly demonstrated that he would be no one's puppet. The elaborate constitutional arrangements of the consulate, with its 3 consuls and complex system of checks and balances, concealed the reality that power had passed to a single man. The Constitution of 1799, which established the consulate, represented Napoleon's genius for creating institutions that appeared democratic while concentrating real power in his hands. Universal male suffrage was restored, but the complex system of indirect election ensured that the government could control the results. The Senate, tribunate, and legislative body provided forums for debate, but real power lay with the first consul, who controlled the executive and had the right to initiate legislation. Napoleon had learned from the failures of the Directory that effective government required unity of command. The Concordat of 1801, negotiated between Napoleon and Pope Pius VII, represented a brilliant solution to the religious divisions that had plagued France since the civil constitution of the clergy. The agreement recognized Catholicism as the religion of the majority of French citizens while maintaining the principle of religious toleration. The Church regained its public role and much of its property, but remained subordinate to the state. Most importantly, the Concordat ended the schism between juring and non-juring clergy that had divided French Catholics for more than a decade. The Code Napoleon, promulgated in 1804, represented perhaps Napoleon's greatest and most lasting achievement. This comprehensive legal code, based on Roman law and revolutionary principles, established the equality of all citizens before the law while protecting property rights and patriarchal authority. The code's clarity and comprehensiveness made it a model for legal systems throughout Europe and the Americas, spreading French legal principles far beyond the borders of France itself. Even today, the influence of the Napoleonic Code can be seen in the legal systems of dozens of countries. The establishment of the Legion of Honor in 1802 revealed Napoleon's understanding of human nature and his skill at creating institutions that would support his regime. The Legion, which rewarded both military and civilian achievement, appealed to the French love of distinction while avoiding the hereditary character of old regime honors. By creating a new nobility based on service rather than birth, Napoleon satisfied the ambitions of his supporters while maintaining the revolutionary principle of careers open to talent. The transformation of the consulate into the empire in 1804 marked the final abandonment of republican government in France. Napoleon's coronation as Emperor of the French, in the presence of Pope Pius VII at Notre Dame Cathedral, created a new form of monarchy that combined revolutionary legitimacy with imperial grandeur. The ceremony itself, with Napoleon crowning himself rather than receiving the crown from the Pope, symbolized the independence of the new regime from both republican and monarchical tradition. The continental system, Napoleon's attempt to defeat Britain through economic warfare, represented the logical extension of the Revolutionary Wars into the realm of economics. Unable to invade Britain directly, Napoleon sought to exclude British goods from European markets, hoping to destroy British prosperity and force the island nation to make peace. The system required the cooperation of all European powers and ultimately led to the expansion of French control across the continent as Napoleon sought to enforce his economic blockade. The Napoleonic Wars, which raged across Europe from 1803 to 1815, spread the principles of the French Revolution, while also provoking nationalist reactions that would ultimately contribute to Napoleon's downfall. The Grande Armée, with its revolutionary organization and tactics, achieved spectacular victories at Austerlitz, Jena, and Wagram, demonstrating the superiority of French military methods. Yet, each victory also created new enemies and extended French power beyond the point where it could be effectively maintained. The invasion of Spain in 1808 marked the beginning of Napoleon's decline, though few recognized it at the time. The Spanish people's resistance to French occupation created the first successful popular uprising against Napoleonic rule, while the Duke of Wellington's campaigns in the peninsula tied down hundreds of thousands of French troops. The guerrilla warfare that developed in Spain would provide a model for later resistance movements and demonstrated that even the Grande Armée could be worn down by determined popular resistance. The Russian campaign of 1812 represented the catastrophic culmination of Napoleon's imperial ambitions. The invasion of Russia with more than 600,000 men was intended to force Tsar Alexander the Fam to maintain the continental system and acknowledge French hegemony in Europe. Instead, it became a disaster that destroyed the Grande Armée and demonstrated the limits of Napoleonic power. The burning of Moscow, the terrible retreat through the Russian winter, and the crossing of the Berezina became synonymous with military catastrophe. As you settle deeper into peaceful rest, let the images of that great retreat flow through your mind like a gentle stream. The Grande Armée that had conquered Europe melted away in the Russian vastness, leaving behind a trail of abandoned weapons, dead horses, and frozen soldiers. Napoleon himself, recognizing that his presence was needed in Paris more than on the battlefield, abandoned his army and raced back to France to raise new forces. Behind him, the empire that had seemed so solid began to crumble. The War of Liberation, as the Germans would call the campaign of 1813 to 1814, saw the awakening of European nationalism against French domination. The Battle of Leipzig, the Battle of Nations, brought together Russians, Prussians, Austrians, and Swedes in a grand coalition that finally defeated Napoleon's rebuilt army. The retreat from Germany repeated the pattern of the Russian campaign on a smaller scale, with French power collapsing as rapidly as it had been built. The first abdication of Napoleon in April 1814 and his exile to Elba seemed to mark the end of the revolutionary and Napoleonic epochs. The restoration of Louis XVI, brother of the executed Louis XVI, represented an attempt to return to the old regime, while acknowledging some of the changes wrought by the revolution. The Charter of 1814 established a constitutional monarchy that preserved many revolutionary gains while restoring the legitimacy of the Bourbon dynasty. The 100 Days, Napoleon's dramatic return from Elba in March 1815, demonstrated the continuing appeal of the Napoleonic legend and the weakness of the Bourbon restoration. Landing near Cannes with just a handful of supporters, Napoleon marched to Paris, gathering support as he went. The sight of the former emperor reviewing the troops who had been sent to arrest him, and their decision to join him instead, showed that the revolutionary spirit had not been completely extinguished by defeat and restoration. The Battle of Waterloo on June 18, 1815, brought the Napoleonic adventure to its final close. The Duke of Wellington's Anglo-Allied army, supported by Blucher's Prussians, defeated Napoleon's last army in a battle that was, in Wellington's words, a damn close-run thing. The defeat at Waterloo was final and decisive, ending any possibility of a Napoleonic restoration and consigning the emperor to permanent exile on the remote island of St. Helena. The Congress of Vienna, which redrew the map of Europe after Napoleon's final defeat, represented an attempt to restore the balance of power that had existed before the revolution. The principle of legitimacy, advocated by the French representative Talleyrand, sought to restore the old dynasties and erase the revolutionary changes of the preceding 25 years. Yet the Congress could not completely undo the work of the revolution, and many of the principles established between 1789 and 1815 continued to influence European development. The revolution's impact on French society proved more durable than its political arrangements. The abolition of feudalism, the establishment of civil equality, the codification of law, and the principle of careers open to talent survived the restoration of the monarchy. The peasants who had acquired church and noble lands during the revolution were allowed to keep their property, creating a class of small landowners who would form the backbone of French society throughout the 19th century. The bourgeoisie, which had led the revolution in its early phases, emerged as the dominant force in French society. The revolutionary legacy in religion was equally complex and enduring. Though Catholicism was restored as the dominant religion of France, the revolution had permanently broken the Church's monopoly over French spiritual life. Religious toleration, civil marriage, and divorce remained parts of French law, while the principle of state supremacy over the Church continued to influence French religious policy. The de-Christianization campaign had failed, but it had also demonstrated that religious authority was not immune to political challenge. The revolution's impact on European culture extended far beyond France itself. The Romantic movement in literature and the arts drew heavily on revolutionary themes of individual freedom, popular sovereignty, and national identity. Writers like Lord Byron, Victor Hugo, and Stendhal found in the Revolution a source of inspiration that would influence European culture throughout the 19th century. The very vocabulary of modern politics, terms like left and right, conservative and liberal, nation and citizen, emerged from the revolutionary experience. The principle of popular sovereignty, proclaimed in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, became a powerful force in 19th century European politics. Though the Congress of Vienna attempted to restore the old regime, the revolutionary idea that legitimate government must be based on the consent of the governed continued to inspire democratic movements across Europe. The revolutions of 1830 and 1848, the unification of Italy and Germany, and the development of parliamentary government in Britain all drew on principles first articulated during the French Revolution. The revolution's economic legacy was equally important, though often overlooked. The abolition of guilds and internal trade barriers created a more unified national market, while the metric system and the decimal currency simplified commercial transactions. The emphasis on careers open to talent encouraged entrepreneurship and innovation, contributing to France's industrial development in the 19th century. The Code Napoleon's protection of property rights provided the legal framework for capitalist development. As the night embraces you more fully, consider how the French Revolution created the template for modern political change. The pattern established between 1789 and 1815, the mobilization of popular opinion, the overthrow of existing institutions, the struggle between moderate and radical factions, the emergence of military dictatorship, and the eventual restoration of order would be repeated in revolutions throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. From the Russian Revolution to the Chinese Revolution, revolutionary movements would follow patterns first established in France. The revolution's impact on warfare was equally revolutionary, creating the mass armies and total war that would characterize conflicts from the Napoleonic Wars to World War II. The levée en masse introduced the concept of the nation in arms, while the meritocratic promotion system created a professional officer corps based on ability rather than birth. The combination of revolutionary enthusiasm and military professionalism made the French armies nearly invincible for more than a decade and influenced military organization throughout Europe. The question of women's rights, raised but not resolved during the Revolution, would continue to influence political development throughout the modern period. Though figures like Olympe de Gouges, who wrote the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and the Female Citizen, were silenced during the Terror, their ideas survived to inspire later generations of feminists. The revolution's emphasis on natural rights and human equality contained the seeds of women's liberation, even though these seeds would not fully flower until the 20th century. The revolution's relationship with slavery and colonial empire revealed the contradictions inherent in revolutionary ideology. The Declaration of Rights proclaimed that all men are born free and equal, yet the convention initially hesitated to apply this principle to the enslaved populations of the French colonies. The temporary abolition of slavery in 1794, its restoration by Napoleon in 1802, and its final abolition in 1848 reflected the ongoing struggle to extend revolutionary principles to all human beings regardless of race or origin. The educational legacy of the revolution proved particularly enduring. The revolutionaries' emphasis on public education as essential to Republican citizenship led to the creation of a national educational system that would serve as a model for democratic societies. Though the specific institutions created during the revolution often did not survive, the principle that the state had a responsibility to educate its citizens became a fundamental aspect of modern democratic government. The revolution's impact on language itself reflected its transformative character. The effort to create a unified national language, to replace local dialects with standard French, was part of the larger project of creating a unified nation. The revolutionary and Napoleonic periods saw the spread of French as the language of administration, law, and education throughout France, contributing to the development of modern French national identity. The cult of the Revolution, which developed in the 19th and 20th centuries, transformed the events of 1789 to 1815 into a sacred narrative of human liberation. The storming of the Bastille, the tennis court oath, the execution of the king, and the other great moments of the revolution became symbols of the struggle for freedom and democracy. This mythologization of the revolution gave it a power that extended far beyond its immediate historical impact. The counter-revolutionary tradition, represented by figures like Edmund Burke and Joseph de Maistre, developed a sophisticated critique of revolutionary principles that would influence conservative thought for generations. The argument that society was an organic whole that could not be rationally reconstructed, that tradition and custom were wiser than abstract reason, and that revolutionary change inevitably led to tyranny and violence, became central themes of conservative political philosophy. The historiography of the revolution itself became a battleground for competing interpretations of the revolutionary legacy. Liberal historians like Jules Michelet celebrated the revolution as the triumph of the people over tyranny, while conservative historians like Hippolyte Taine emphasized its violence and chaos. Socialist historians like Jean Jaurès saw the revolution as an incomplete bourgeois revolution that needed to be completed by working-class action. Each generation has found in the revolution what it needed for its own political purposes. The revolution's influence on art and architecture was equally profound. The neoclassical style, which became dominant during the revolutionary and Napoleonic periods, reflected the desire to create forms appropriate to republican virtue and imperial grandeur. Artists like Jacques-Louis David created paintings that served as propaganda for revolutionary and Napoleonic ideals, while architects like Charles Percier and Pierre Fontaine designed monuments that embodied the spirit of the New Age. The revolutionary calendar, though short-lived, represented an attempt to remake time itself according to rational principles. The division of the year into 12 months of 30 days each, with 5 or 6 complementary days added to make a full year, was intended to break the connection with Christian tradition and create a purely secular measurement of time. Though the calendar was abandoned in 1806, it represented the revolutionary ambition to transform every aspect of human existence. The revolution's impact on medicine and science reflected the broader transformation of French society. The establishment of new medical schools, the emphasis on empirical observation, and the connection between medical knowledge and public health all reflected revolutionary principles. Figures like Xavier Bichet and Philippe Pinel made important contributions to medical knowledge, while the revolutionary emphasis on merit rather than birth opened scientific careers to men of talent, regardless of their social origins. As you drift deeper into the peaceful realm of sleep, let your mind rest on the final transformations wrought by this great upheaval. The France that emerged from the revolutionary and Napoleonic periods was fundamentally different from the France of Louis XVI. A society based on privilege and tradition had been replaced by one based on merit and law. A monarchy that claimed divine sanction had been replaced by governments that acknowledged popular sovereignty. A church that had monopolized spiritual authority had been forced to share that authority with secular institutions. The peasants who had formed the majority of the French population in 1789 had been transformed from feudal dependents to property-owning citizens. The abolition of serfdom, feudal dues, and seigneurial courts had liberated them from obligations that had lasted for centuries. The sale of church lands and émigré properties had allowed many peasants to become landowners, creating a class of rural proprietors who would dominate French agriculture throughout the 19th century. The bourgeoisie, which had provided much of the revolutionary leadership, had achieved their goals of legal equality, economic freedom, and political participation. The abolition of guilds and internal trade barriers had created a unified national market, while the protection of property rights had provided security for commercial and industrial investment. The establishment of secular education and careers open to talent had created opportunities for social mobility that had not existed under the old regime. The working classes of Paris and other cities had gained political experience and a sense of their own power through their participation in revolutionary events. Though they had not achieved the social equality that some had demanded, they had learned that popular mobilization could influence government policy. The sans-culotte tradition of direct democracy and popular sovereignty would inspire working-class movements throughout the 19th century. The nobility, though stripped of their feudal privileges and much of their property, had not been completely destroyed. Many had emigrated during the Revolution and returned under Napoleon or the Restoration. Others had accommodated themselves to the new order, serving in the imperial administration or the Napoleonic armies. The principle of careers open to talent had allowed some commoners to acquire noble titles, creating a new nobility based on service rather than birth. The clergy had been forced to accept a subordinate position in French society, but had retained their role as spiritual guides for much of the population. The Concordat had restored the Church's public role while maintaining state control over ecclesiastical affairs. The religious revival of the post-revolutionary period demonstrated that the de-Christianization campaign had failed to destroy popular faith, but it had permanently altered the relationship between church and state. The Revolution's legacy in French political culture proved both enduring and divisive. The principles of popular sovereignty, individual rights, and national unity became fundamental to French political discourse, but their interpretation remained contested. The conflict between those who wanted to extend revolutionary principles and those who wanted to limit them would dominate French politics throughout the 19th century. The international impact of the revolution continued to unfold long after Napoleon's final defeat. The principles of nationalism and popular sovereignty spread across Europe through both French conquest and indigenous development. The wars of liberation against French domination had awakened national consciousness in Germany, Italy, and Spain, creating new political forces that would reshape European politics throughout the 19th century. The revolutionary tradition itself became a powerful force in European and world politics. The model of popular revolution, the overthrow of existing institutions, and the creation of new forms of government inspired democratic and socialist movements throughout the world. From the Latin American Wars of Independence to the European revolutions of 1848, from the unification movements in Italy and Germany to the Russian Revolution of 1917, the French revolutionary model provided both inspiration and practical guidance. The Constitution of the United States, ratified during the early years of the French Revolution, had provided some inspiration for French revolutionaries, but the French experience was far more radical and transformative than the American. The American Revolution had created new institutions within an existing society, while the French Revolution had attempted to transform society itself. This fundamental difference would influence the development of democratic institutions throughout the world. The revolution's economic legacy included both the destruction of feudal restrictions on economic activity and the creation of new forms of state intervention in the economy. The abolition of guilds and internal trade barriers had created conditions for capitalist development, while the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars had demonstrated the state's capacity to mobilize economic resources for political purposes. This dual legacy of economic liberalism and state intervention would influence French economic policy throughout the modern period. The Revolution's approach to cultural questions, the relationship between national unity and regional diversity, the role of religion in public life, the function of education in creating citizens, would continue to influence French politics and society. The revolutionary emphasis on creating a unified national culture through education, language policy, and civic ritual established patterns that would persist well into the 20th century. As the peaceful hours of night deepen around you, let the final echoes of this great transformation resonate gently in your mind. The French Revolution had begun with the simple demand for fiscal reform and had ended with the complete transformation of French society and the reshaping of European politics. What had started as an attempt to solve the monarchy's financial problems had become a fundamental challenge to the entire basis of traditional society. The men who had taken the tennis court oath in 1789 could never have imagined that their actions would lead to the execution of the king, the terror, the conquest of Europe, and the creation of a new form of society based on the principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity. They had sought to reform the old regime, not to destroy it completely, but the logic of events had carried them far beyond their original intentions. The final saga of the French Revolution was not its end in 1815, but its continuation throughout the modern period. The principles established between 1789 and 1815, popular sovereignty, individual rights, national self-determination, careers open to talent, religious toleration, and legal equality, became the foundation of modern democratic society. Though these principles were often honored more in theory than in practice, they provided standards by which all subsequent governments could be judged. The revolution had demonstrated that human societies were not fixed by nature or divine will, but could be consciously transformed by human action. This revelation was both liberating and terrifying, opening possibilities for both progress and destruction that previous generations could never have imagined. The modern world, with all its achievements and tragedies, was born in the streets of Paris between 1789 and 1815. The great churches of France, their bells once again calling the faithful to prayer, the chateaux in the countryside, many now owned by bourgeois purchasers rather than ancient noble families, the fields worked by peasant proprietors rather than feudal dependents, all bore witness to the profound transformation that had occurred. France had been reborn, and in its rebirth, it had shown the world new possibilities for human organization and achievement. The revolution's promise that all citizens could participate in government, that merit rather than birth should determine social position, that reason rather than tradition should guide policy, and that the nation rather than the dynasty should be the focus of loyalty had not been fully realized. But these promises had been made, and they could not be unmade. They would continue to inspire and challenge future generations, ensuring that the French Revolution would remain a living force in human affairs, long after its immediate political effects had been absorbed into history. In the quiet of this night, as the great story draws to its close, the France that had emerged from revolution and empire settled into a new rhythm of life. The dramatic upheavals of the revolutionary years gave way to the quieter transformations of the 19th century. But the fundamental changes wrought between 1789 and 1815 would continue to shape French society and inspire democratic movements throughout the world. The revolution was over, but its legacy was eternal, woven into the very fabric of modern civilization, like golden threads in a tapestry that would continue to unfold through all the centuries to come. The restoration of the Bourbon monarchy under Louis XVIII marked not a return to the old regime, but rather the beginning of a new synthesis between revolutionary principles and traditional authority. The Charter of 1814, France's new constitution, acknowledged many of the gains made during the revolutionary period, while attempting to restore monarchical legitimacy. Civil equality before the law, religious toleration, and the abolition of feudalism were preserved, even as the white flag of the Bourbon replaced the tricolour above the palace of the Tuileries. As you settle deeper into the embrace of sleep, imagine the France of the Restoration, where former revolutionaries and returned émigrés attempted to build a new society from the fragments of the old. In the salons of Paris, veterans of the Convention sat alongside nobles who had spent decades in exile. Their conversations a fascinating mixture of reminiscence and cautious hope. The Café Procope, where Voltaire had once held court, now welcomed men who had served Napoleon alongside those who had fled from his rule. The economic transformation of France continued throughout the Restoration period as the country slowly recovered from the devastation of the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. The continental system had forced French industry to develop in isolation from British competition, creating manufacturing capabilities that would serve the country well in the post-war period. The silk manufacturers of Lyon, the cotton spinners of Normandy, and the metallurgists of the East began to emerge as significant forces in the European economy. The religious revival that characterized the Restoration reflected both the exhaustion of revolutionary radicalism and the deep spiritual needs of a people who had lived through unprecedented upheaval. The Congregation, a Catholic organization that promoted traditional values and monarchical loyalty, gained significant influence in government and society. Missions were organized throughout France to re-Christianize regions that had been affected by de-Christianization, their fervent preaching often accompanied by the restoration of crosses and shrines that had been destroyed during the Terror. The ultra-royalists, led by figures like the Count of Artois, the king's brother who would later become Charles VI, pushed for more complete restoration of the old regime. They sought not only the return of monarchical authority, but also the restoration of aristocratic privilege and the preeminence of the Catholic Church. Their influence grew throughout the 1820s, creating tensions that would eventually lead to renewed revolution. Yet even they could not completely ignore the changes that had occurred during the revolutionary period. The memory of Napoleon continued to haunt French political life throughout the Restoration, creating what historians would later call the Napoleonic legend. The former emperor's exile on St. Helena, where he dictated his memoirs to the Count of Las Casas and other companions, provided him with the opportunity to reshape his historical image. No longer the conqueror who had brought war to Europe, he became the defender of revolutionary principles against the forces of reaction. The man who had carried the ideals of 1789 across the continent. The publication of the Memorial of St. Helena in 1823 transformed Napoleon from a defeated emperor into a romantic hero. Las Casas' account of Napoleon's final years, filled with regret for his mistakes and noble sentiment about his true intentions, created an image that would inspire generations of French Republicans and Democrats. The Napoleonic legend became a powerful force in French politics, offering an alternative to both Bourbon legitimacy and Republican democracy. As the night continues its gentle progression, let your mind wander through the intellectual ferment of Restoration France, where the revolutionary tradition lived on in the writings of liberal theorists and the activism of secret societies. The Carbonari, inspired by their Italian counterparts, organized resistance to the Bourbon government, while liberal newspapers like the Constitution, Nell, and the Globe kept alive the memory of revolutionary achievements. Benjamin Constant, the brilliant political theorist, articulated a vision of liberal constitutional government that drew on both revolutionary experience and English precedent. The July Revolution of 1830 demonstrated that the revolutionary spirit had not been extinguished by 15 years of Bourbon rule. The ordinances of Charles V, which dissolved the Chamber of Deputies, restricted the franchise, and censored the press, provoked 3 days of popular uprising in Paris that brought down the restored monarchy. The barricades that rose in the streets of the capital, manned by workers, students, and bourgeois liberals, showed that the Parisian people retained their capacity for revolutionary action. The ascension of Louis-Philippe, the citizen king, represented a compromise between revolutionary principles and monarchical stability. The Duke of Orleans, who had fought in the revolutionary armies and supported liberal causes throughout the Restoration, embodied the possibility of reconciling democratic aspirations with constitutional monarchy. His reign, known as the July Monarchy, would attempt to create a government that satisfied both the bourgeoisie's desire for order and the people's demand for liberty. The Revolution of 1830 sent shockwaves throughout Europe, inspiring liberal and national movements from Belgium to Poland. The successful overthrow of the Bourbon monarchy demonstrated that the principles of 1789 retained their power to motivate popular action, while the establishment of the July monarchy showed that revolutionary change could be channeled into constitutional forms. The revolution proved that France remained the laboratory of European political experimentation. The industrial development that accelerated during the July monarchy transformed French society in ways that the political revolutionaries of 1789 could never have anticipated. The construction of railways, the expansion of textile manufacturing, and the growth of heavy industry created new social classes and new forms of social conflict. The emergence of an industrial working class, concentrated in the factories of Paris, Lyon, and the northern departments, added a new dimension to French political life. The silk workers' revolts in Lyon in 1831 and 1834 provided the first major examples of industrial conflict in modern France. The Canuts, as the silk workers were known, combined economic grievances with political demands, creating a form of social movement that would become characteristic of modern industrial society. Their black flag, inscribed with the motto, "Live working or die fighting," became a symbol of working-class resistance that would inspire later generations of labor organizers. As you drift deeper into peaceful slumber, consider how the revolutionary tradition evolved during the July monarchy to encompass not only political rights, but also social and economic equality. The rise of socialism, represented by figures like Henri de Saint-Simon, Charles Fourier, and Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, extended revolutionary thinking beyond the political sphere into questions of property, labor, and social organization. These early socialists argued that the revolution of 1789 had been incomplete, achieving political equality while leaving economic inequality intact. The Republican opposition to the July monarchy centered around newspapers like the national and political clubs like the Society of the Rights of Man, kept alive the democratic tradition of the early revolution. Republicans argued that true popular sovereignty required not constitutional monarchy, but democratic republic, where the people themselves would exercise power through their elected representatives. Their secret societies and public demonstrations maintained the revolutionary tradition of popular political participation. The Revolution of 1848, which overthrew the July monarchy and established the Second Republic, represented the culmination of this opposition movement. The February days, when Parisian crowds forced Louis-Philippe to abdicate, showed once again that the French people retained their capacity for revolutionary action. The provisional government that emerged from this revolution proclaimed the Republic and established universal male suffrage, finally achieving the democratic goals that had been articulated but not realized in 1789. The workshops program, established by the provisional government to provide employment for the unemployed workers of Paris, represented an attempt to address the social question that had emerged from industrial development. Louis Blanc's concept of the right to work, embodied in these national workshops, extended revolutionary principles into the realm of social and economic rights. Though the workshops were ultimately abolished, they represented an important precedent for state intervention in economic affairs. The June days of 1848, when Parisian workers rose in revolt against the closure of the national workshops, revealed the social tensions that had developed within French society since 1789. The brutal suppression of this uprising by General Cavaignac demonstrated that the bourgeois republic was prepared to use force against the working class when their interests conflicted. The defeat of the June insurgents marked the beginning of a new phase in the revolutionary tradition, one that would increasingly focus on social and economic, rather than merely political transformation. The election of Louis Napoleon Bonaparte as President of the Second Republic in December 1848 brought the Napoleonic legend back to power in French politics. The nephew of the great emperor, who had previously attempted unsuccessful coups at Strasbourg and Boulogne, won overwhelming popular support based on his name and his promises to restore French grandeur. His victory demonstrated the continuing appeal of Napoleonic symbolism and the desire for strong leadership in times of social conflict. The coup d'état of December 2nd, 1851, which brought the Second Republic to an end and established the Second Empire, showed how democratic institutions could be subverted from within. Louis Napoleon's dissolution of the National Assembly and his appeal to the people through plebiscite represented a new form of authoritarianism that claimed democratic legitimacy while suppressing democratic institutions. This Bonapartist model would prove influential in later developments of authoritarian rule throughout Europe. As the night deepens around you, let your thoughts turn to the Second Empire, where Napoleon III attempted to reconcile authoritarian rule with modern economic development and social progress. The rebuilding of Paris under Baron Haussmann, the expansion of railway networks, the development of banking and industry, and the gradual liberalization of political institutions represented an attempt to achieve progress without revolution. The emperor sought to embody both the legacy of his uncle and the aspirations of modern France. The transformation of Paris during the Second Empire created the modern city that visitors still admire today. The broad boulevards, the elegant parks, the grand opera house, and the modernized infrastructure represented not only aesthetic achievement, but also political calculation. Haussmann's redesign made the city more difficult to barricade, while providing employment for the working class and opportunities for the bourgeoisie. The new Paris became a symbol of the marriage between authority and progress that characterized the Second Empire. The Mexican adventure and the Franco-Prussian War revealed the limitations of Napoleonic revival in the modern world. The attempt to establish a French-backed empire in Mexico failed disastrously, while the war with Prussia exposed the weaknesses of the French military system and led to the capture of Napoleon III himself at Sedan. The collapse of the Second Empire in September 1870 opened a new chapter in French political development and demonstrated once again the fragility of authoritarian rule. The proclamation of the Third Republic on September 4th, 1870, marked the return of republican government to France, but under circumstances far different from those of 1792 or 1848. The new republic faced the immediate challenges of German invasion, Prussian siege of Paris, and internal political division. The government of national defense, led by figures like Léon Gambetta and Jules Favre, attempted to organize resistance while also establishing new republican institutions. The Paris Commune of 1871 represented the most radical expression of the revolutionary tradition since the Terror of 1793 to 1794. The Communards, who seized control of Paris after the armistice with Prussia, attempted to create a new form of democratic government based on direct popular participation and social equality. Their experiment in revolutionary democracy, though it lasted only 2 months, became a powerful symbol for socialist and anarchist movements throughout the world. The suppression of the Commune during the Bloody Week of May 1871 was more brutal than any of the previous episodes of revolutionary violence. The troops of the Versailles government, supported by the Prussian army, killed more than 20,000 communards in their reconquest of Paris. This massacre created a new generation of martyrs for the revolutionary cause, while demonstrating the determination of the established order to prevent radical social change. The consolidation of the Third Republic in the 1870s and 1880s represented the final triumph of the moderate republican tradition that had emerged from the Revolution of 1789. The constitutional laws of 1875, which established the framework of French government for the next 70 years, created a parliamentary system based on universal male suffrage and civil liberties. The Republic had finally achieved the stable democratic government that had eluded France since 1789. As you settle more deeply into rest, consider how the revolutionary tradition was institutionalized during the early Third Republic through education, ceremony, and memory. The laws of Jules Ferry, which established free, compulsory, and secular primary education, were designed to create republican citizens who would understand and support democratic institutions. The school curriculum emphasized the history of the revolution and the values of liberty, equality, and fraternity. The celebration of Bastille Day, established as a national holiday in 1880, transformed the revolutionary tradition into official patriotic ceremony. The annual festivities with their military parades, popular balls, and fireworks created a ritualized memory of the revolution that emphasized its achievements while downplaying its violence. The Marseillaise, officially adopted as the national anthem, provided a musical expression of revolutionary values that could unite all Republicans. The construction of monuments to revolutionary heroes throughout France during the late 19th century created a landscape of memory that reinforced Republican values. Statues of figures like Danton, Gambetta, and the Republic herself appeared in town squares across the country, while street names honored revolutionary leaders and events. This commemorative culture helped to embed the revolutionary tradition in French national identity. The Dreyfus Affair of the 1890s demonstrated how the revolutionary tradition of individual rights and justice could be mobilized in defense of democratic values. The campaign to vindicate Captain Alfred Dreyfus, led by intellectuals like Émile Zola and politicians like Georges Clemenceau, drew on the revolutionary heritage of civil liberties and equality before the law. The eventual triumph of the Dreyfusards represented a victory for the principles established in the Declaration of Rights of 1789. The separation of church and state, achieved through the law of 1905, completed the secularization process that had begun during the Revolution. The separation, which ended the Concordat negotiated by Napoleon, established the principle of laïcité that would become fundamental to French political culture. This achievement represented the final victory of Enlightenment principles over traditional religious authority in French public life. The Great War of 1914 to 1918 tested the durability of French republican institutions and revolutionary values under the extreme stress of modern industrial warfare. The Union Sacrée, which united all political parties in defense of the nation, demonstrated that the Third Republic had achieved the national unity that had eluded previous regimes. The war effort required the mobilization of the entire nation in ways that recalled the levée en masse of 1793. The Russian Revolution of 1917 revived global interest in the French revolutionary model, while also challenging it with new forms of socialist revolution. The Bolsheviks consciously modeled themselves on the Jacobins of 1793, adopting similar methods of revolutionary terror and popular mobilization. However, their emphasis on class struggle rather than national unity represented a significant departure from the French precedent. As the peaceful hours continue their gentle progression, let your mind rest on the interwar period, when France served as a refuge for political exiles from across Europe. The Russian émigrés who fled the Bolshevik Revolution, the German Republicans who escaped Nazi persecution, and the Spanish Republicans who fled Franco's victory all found sanctuary in a France that remembered its own revolutionary heritage. Paris became once again the capital of international republican and democratic movements. The Popular Front government of 1936, led by Léon Blum, represented the first socialist government in French history and drew explicitly on the revolutionary tradition of popular sovereignty. The strikes and factory occupations that accompanied the Popular Front's victory recalled the sans-culotte movement of the 1790s, while the government's social reforms extended the revolutionary principle of equality into new areas of life. The 40-hour work week, paid vacations, and collective bargaining rights represented the achievement of social rights that earlier revolutionaries had only dreamed of. The defeat of 1940 and the establishment of the Vichy regime challenged the revolutionary tradition more seriously than any previous crisis. Marshal Pétain's National Revolution explicitly rejected the principles of 1789, replacing liberty, equality, fraternity with work, family, fatherland. The collaboration with Nazi Germany represented a fundamental betrayal of the revolutionary heritage of human rights and national independence. The resistance movement, however, drew heavily on the revolutionary tradition in its struggle against occupation and collaboration. The Free French movement led by Charles de Gaulle, the communist partisans, and the various resistance networks all invoked the memory of 1789 and 1793 in their fight for liberation. The Resistance Charter, with its commitment to democracy and social justice, represented a renewal of revolutionary principles under 20th century conditions. The liberation of 1944 brought a new attempt to realize the unfulfilled promises of the revolution through the programs of the National Council of Resistance. The nationalization of key industries, the establishment of social security, and the extension of voting rights to women represented significant advances toward the revolutionary goal of equality. The purge of collaborators, though it involved far less violence than previous revolutionary episodes, showed that the tradition of revolutionary justice retained its power. The Fourth Republic, established in 1946, attempted to create a more democratic constitution than any previous French regime. The new constitution emphasized social and economic rights alongside traditional civil liberties, reflecting the influence of socialist and communist parties that had emerged from the resistance. However, the political instability that characterized the Fourth Republic showed that the problem of creating stable democratic government had not been finally resolved. The Algerian War of 1954 to 1962 created another crisis for French republican institutions, as the military and settler revolt challenged civilian authority and democratic values. The return of Charles de Gaulle and the establishment of the Fifth Republic in 1958 represented another attempt to reconcile authority with democracy, drawing on both Napoleonic and republican traditions. De Gaulle's personal legitimacy, based on his role in the resistance and liberation, allowed him to resolve the Algerian crisis while preserving democratic institutions. The events of May 1968 demonstrated that the revolutionary tradition retained its capacity to inspire popular movements even in advanced industrial society. The student uprising that began at the University of Nanterre and spread to the Sorbonne, combined with the general strike that paralyzed the country, recalled the great revolutionary journeys of the past. Though the movement ultimately failed to achieve its revolutionary goals, it showed that the spirit of 1789 could still move the French people. As you drift into the deepest levels of peaceful sleep, let the final echoes of this great revolutionary tradition resonate gently through your consciousness. The bicentennial celebration of the Revolution in 1989 demonstrated how completely the revolutionary heritage had been integrated into French national identity. The festivities, which included both solemn commemoration and joyful celebration, showed that France had finally reconciled itself to its revolutionary past. The contemporary French Republic, with its commitment to human rights, democratic governance, and social solidarity, represents the mature realization of principles first articulated in 1789. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen remains part of the current French Constitution, while the revolutionary motto of liberty, equality, fraternity continues to inspire French policy both domestically and internationally. France's leadership in the European Union, its commitment to international human rights, and its defense of democratic values throughout the world all reflect the continuing influence of its revolutionary heritage. The French Revolution's global legacy extends far beyond France itself, influencing democratic movements, constitutional development, and human rights advocacy throughout the world. The United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in 1948, drew heavily on the French Declaration of 1789, while liberation movements from Haiti to Vietnam have invoked the French revolutionary example in their struggles for independence and democracy. In this quiet moment, as the great story reaches its final resolution, the revolutionary tradition that began in 1789 continues to live and breathe in the daily life of democratic societies throughout the world. The principles of popular sovereignty, individual rights, and human equality that emerged from the French Revolution have become the common heritage of humanity, inspiring new generations of activists, reformers, and dreamers who continue to work for a more just and free world. The France that slumbers peacefully tonight, its ancient stones warmed by centuries of struggle and achievement, bears within itself the memory of all those who sacrificed for liberty, equality, and fraternity. From the tennis court oath to the Declaration of Rights, from the storming of the Bastille to the final establishment of democratic republic, the revolutionary tradition flows like a deep river through French history, carrying the hopes and dreams of all humanity toward a future that remains forever bright with promise and possibility.